This is a story I wrote. It's called The Black Mountains of Afghanistan. It's in my book. I'll read it to you. The Black Mountains of Afghanistan. He woke up in the morning. The mountains towered above him. He had lost 2 of his friends yesterday. He wondered how long it would keep going like this. Would it happen again tomorrow? Maybe. Maybe it would. Maybe it would be him. Maybe he'd never know it. It was almost comforting. He knew it was. He could go with that. He could go with that each day. Sure, that'd work. It's not like he hadn't had to find those kinds of things before. Maybe they all had one. Maybe what he was thinking was what they had thought. That was disturbing. Maybe it was so. But he was in no frame of mind to do the logic of it. He could have stayed home after all. It had been his choice. Whatever anyone might say, it had been his choice and his alone, no matter anything. It was what it was now, no matter anything. It was another thing to keep him going. Did it keep them going? Did they know about it? More disturbing thoughts. Comfortingly, they weren't more than they were. They didn't have a further logic. What would it be like then? No, better not go there. He knew he was good for it, but all of his death. Kids dead, faces upturned. Ah, the hell. Death came to everyone, whatever side you might be on. He'd be dead like they were either way, here or somewhere else. Those mountains were really tall. Afghanistan, what a place. The poor people, and they were really poor. Poorer than he knew he'd ever see again. It was even poorer. There weren't words for what it was. It was like a big nothing. And the nothing had swallowed up all these people. And then that was how they lived, and they got used to it. What a place. Maybe he'd come back someday when this was all over. But he couldn't conceive of it being over. Maybe it would end. But he didn't know what that would mean on the ground. Because that doesn't mean it'd be over. And then something would be over, but what was it? It seemed like permanent war. Not because of the military, well, not just because of them, but because of how it was here. It'd always be a war here. The nothing wasn't going away, and that's what these people knew. Knew it, and it was their environment. He thought it must have been that way for centuries. Warlords going away? The people? That religion? No. So what the heck? The mountains were beautiful here, though. They were dark mountains even in the daytime. The rock was a black kind of rock. Those tall slabs all broken up. He wondered where that came from. The kids too, they had just such beautiful faces. Different from ours, but just the same as ours. He felt a tear in his eye. He stopped it, sort of. He lay on his back on his cot and looked up at the mountains. They were so beautiful. He wondered whether the generals ever looked at them like that. Just that they might be a little beautiful sometimes. He knew other people who did. It wasn't really the kind of thing people would think they'd talk about. The general said that all of the bad guys were hiding up there in those mountains. They said that's where they'd have to go if they wanted to fight them. It made him curious when they used the want and if. He wasn't an intellectual type, but it seemed clear to him that there was a lot of subjectivity in those want-if conditions. It seemed to him that it wasn't consistent with the objective and the desires to get it done. He thought, in the beginning, that that was a basic formality that didn't need to be tested by watching how people actually talked. And it also seemed to plan on the ground. He'd gotten used to it, though. It was that nothingness that he thought swallowed up the people who lived here. And they got used to it. And they didn't know really anything else. It could be like that with how his people talked and seemed to base their plans on things, when on the ground they were different from the formalities of all the stated objectives by the generals and the politicians. He didn't know very much about the politicians, but he knew enough to know that their mission ideas were like the mission ideas of the generals. A degree away, maybe, but that was natural. There was a reason he felt happy about some of this. He understood a lot of things that he thought his friends probably did not. And he thought probably never would. He felt good to have perspective. He knew they had perspective, though just as based on thinking logic as his. When they went out, none of it mattered. It didn't matter what it was. If it played out in any way, they were out. No one would notice how it did, or they'd be too busy trying to keep their senses and minds on the ground and measuring distances and poking around their guns, usually laying them in harness across their stomachs and chests. Some of the patrols were not really planned in a serious way, but he didn't think any other kind of planning was possible here. That's why it happened. It was just a little logic. It meant something to him to get some of this stuff right. It didn't stop people from dying or getting hurt, though, but he thought that it might keep some other things from dying, like being able to go home and think the same but different. Still, it was something he would have missed out on. Missing out on something that helped nobody the way he thought people were normally helped. He turned his back to look at those black slabs pouring down from the sky. And he wondered whether it was really true that it would help nothing or nobody. Maybe it could help somehow. Who knew? Everything was possible. It didn't create an immediate dilemma. It was fine, and it made him feel good. That was help enough. There were things, though, that he knew he was keeping from himself as he kept looking up at the black slabs in the sky. How was it possible that they didn't ever fall down? Wasn't it like a cake rock? He knew he was just an example, that there were many, that they all had it. Not an example, because nobody who mattered cared enough. Maybe they didn't see it. They all had it. How'd they bring it home, though? Would anyone get it? Maybe some. It was possible. Why not? Would he try? He wasn't even trying here. He was just testing. Maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to test further or again. Maybe he had a good comfort zone now. Maybe it was fine the way it was. Yeah, it must have been. It was fine the way it was. There was no reason to tempt the devil. Down in the mountains were beautiful. God, how long are we going to do this? He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. The water in the air settled on him as his body stilled. It rolled off the bag. The Black Mountains towered above him, caked layers of mountain rock slab, teetering and steadfast watches at the keep. He could feel the dust settling on his face. He kept his eyes shut while he dug his fingers into his skin to wipe the unharmful dew-lit beige grin from his eyelids, nose, across his cheeks in the cavities, in their veins, and up into his forehead, where he stopped before he reached the hairline, without complaint. He sat part up with his elbows behind him and looked around. Then he sat back and went back to sleep. Later in the early day, he was walking up front in the line. Bursts came from the rocks across from them at the foot of the mountain. He reflexively bent down and held his gun calmly, with his eyes already focusing in the direction of the bursts of the AK-47s. The MK-19 PG tripod was mounted onto the ground, and they launched 3 PGs into the front area, and 2 into the back, where he had estimated their location to have been, and had told the operator of the tripod and machine. Dust and rock rose into the air and flew over at them. He had already started to walk across the field in the direction of the exploded PGs, so he just ducked a little and turned the side of his head to the flying debris. He had done this before. For that distance, though, the ones who'd fired on them would unlikely be wounded, so they'd either be gone or dead on the spot. They were gone. It was almost always like that. And when it wasn't, it was just written up and didn't make a difference to anything or to the way they felt throughout the rest of the day. He turned his head and he waved back. He completed the movement with the rest of his body with a quick radius of visual checking, and then walked back in the direction from which he had come. When they had the chance, all of them, each at their own time, would snatch a prolonged glance, a short gaze up at the Black Mountains. Sometimes by sheer coincidence, they'd all do it at the same time. But it was unself-conscious, like the hair on their chests. They just looked around at each other, and that was that, and they went on. Never really having stopped. He turned his head up to the cake-splintered black slabs and gazed up to the tops of them, the very mountain tops where the tips of them went into the sky. The sky always seemed black in Afghanistan, like it was one with the mountain tops and the nipple-like crests of their eternal tips into the sky. Even when the sky was blue and the sun was out, the sky seemed black with the mountains, and he thought that was what made them so beautiful. He could look at them forever, but there wasn't time. But being with him as they were day to day was enough, and probably more than if he had just sat in a spot and watched them forever. On this one he was alone. The men in front turned their heads back to him as he was taking up the tail, and he smiled because they smiled. They knew he had caught a glimpse for himself. He felt happy and smiled. He smiled to himself, looking down at the ground, passing under him while he walked. If he could communicate this when he went home, he knew that he'd be able to be normal for the rest of his life, unless something horrible intervened between now and then. But even with that, he felt that it would only be with the approval of the mountains. Before they found out that he had exquisite natural distance gauging abilities and some later tests for war aptitudes, they had placed him in the information unit where he started to learn the military homegrown computer code for the computerized field instruments. He could be able to add code as was necessary with the cooperation of the manufacturer of the devices, but the code was essentially military property, and the military insisted on at least maintaining the upgrades and the new patches themselves. The mountains in Afghanistan were ancient and sturdy, but he thought they were like giant blocks of computer code. One small block falls and the rest falls. Not on the people who lived there and who died there, more than he and his people do, but on them, on he and his people, on the military might. But he didn't mind if they fell on him alone one day. He thought they were beautiful. He'd get up and walk out of the rubble anyway. So would the rest of them, and they'd all look at each other and walk out. But this time they'd look at each other with a different knowledge. Maybe a knowledge that they'd go home, or that they'd go on here. So would the people who lived there. He knew the mountains wouldn't hurt the people who thought they were beautiful. No, it was the total machine that would be destroyed. He slept. They returned to camp at around 1600. He slept dreaming just lightly, able to just feel the sweetness of getting needed and desired sleep. Things were white. The air was white. It was like three-dimensional space had been painted white. Soldiers passed through the air in their whited, green, and black camos. They strode. They were his people. They didn't sing. They didn't dance. They were soldiers. They were professionals. They had jobs to do each day, tasks. They built up their set of rituals to conform to the tasks outside of patrols and missions. He woke up and stared at the black of the blue sky. He thought about his mother and father. Had the divorce been necessary? He looked around him, getting up on his elbows. 3 years. He looked at the brown dirt on the ground in the distance near the rocks at the base of the mountains. It didn't really matter, the divorce. All things were necessary. He lay back down. Birth, marriage, divorce, but all things. But he had not been blooded, not in these mountains, with all the death in children's bodies. Their dead small feet shoed, covered over with blankets. He had still not been blooded. It was a paradox. They, the mountains, were healing the divorce, in a new divorce, in the continuum of divorce, of conflict. These people deserved better. All of the people here, his and theirs, they belonged to each other, these people. He belonged to his. His and theirs could belong to each other only in the polite and respectful nod of their departure from this country. They needed to get down the valley that day. He had been asked by the captain to do the job that day. They were to return to where they had been yesterday, to pick up tracks, to tempt death. He knew that. He knew that in this war, that was the game. They had to go out and make sure that they would tempt death. Death's temptations had a chance of working through them to tempt the enemy. They were up the valley, way up the valley, he thought. And he thought it had been far enough. He had been a Frank Zappa fan since he was a kid. Some were, some weren't. There was nothing in between. Most people had never had to worry about it since they never got exposed to his music. But now he thought of the song, A Little Green Rosette. A little green Rosette, he thought to himself. The captain slowed down, then completely stopped. The man was trying to listen. He looked back at him and waved to come forward to him. He went forward and stood in a half-squatting position next to the captain, who was just a little higher than him. He was trying to listen to what the captain was listening to, or thought he was listening to. He thought he might have to listen to the captain's mind to hear whatever the man was listening to. Then he'd hear it like him, whether it was solid or not. A scream of MIGs killed the sky with an evil terror roar, in the split second before he knew that he could never get into the captain's mind. They were both the same now, charred and no longer listening. He could not hear. He saw the captain's corpse, his head both decapitated and not decapitated. It was like a burnt mummy's face crumbling into the dirt separately. The last in the line of Little Green Rosettes in that country. Some of the guys were moaning and calling. Before he could give some more effort at movement, he saw a movement of black bodies in the distance over at the lower rocks of the mountains. White terrestrial flocks flew around them in a dance. They were moving fast. He knew they'd be there within 50 or 60 seconds maximum. He could see them in his mind butchering all of them. He knew they'd butchered the dead also. So he crossed himself and put himself on his side and twisted his neck around so that the back of his head was on the ground and his feet were stretched out and his face was facing the sky. He looked up at the sky. He turned his eyes a few degrees and looked up at the Black Mountains of Afghanistan. He thought it was a beautiful word, Afghanistan. He knew the mountains would approve. He closed his eyes and knew that he would be normal for the rest of his life.